Before we get into the video, I need you guys to do me a favour. Number 1, like the video. Also comment, let me know your thoughts on the story. The Chainsaw Gang consisted of white-collar men born from parents who survived wartime and settled in the Camberwell area of London. Often fed on rabbit stew and bread, men forged a life for themselves in a time when there was a massive divide between the rich and the poor. London at the time was just forgetting the turmoil and troubles of the Second World War. If the 1950s were black and white and bleak, then the 1960s were vibrant and technicolor. That meant the capital was full of hope and promise, and a scrum of men established themselves as gangsters. The drug trade was booming, taxing nightclubs was rife, and gangs had fortified their positions on postcodes and territories, supplying nightclubs with both booze and cigs. Now the Chainsaw Gang was no exception. The most famous of the Chainsaw Gang was that of James Moody. Standing at 6 feet tall and weighing a mammoth 18 stones, he was sometimes called Mick. Jimmy Moody's square face was known across the manor, often utilised to shattered thigh bones and even complete contract case of rivals and even the M's of Merchant Navy, after an argument for which he was jailed for 6 years. Now, regarded by his peers to be both professional and efficient, Jimmy wore many hats. He was an armed robber, he was an associate of the Kray twins, and had famously been part of the Hitman Squad and part of the Richardson gang. The Chainsaw Gang's name was derived from the fact that London gangsters had begun to systematically target cash-in-transit vans for large amounts of cash, and they often used a chainsaw to cut into the side of the van. In the belting heat of 1976 summertime, renowned robber Charlie Chopper Knight saw an open market on cash-in-transit vans. So like a lot of other localised gangsters, Charlie was looking for his next big score, something that was going to change the landscape of London crime, take the East Ender from a local criminal to a Mr. Big. What Charlie Chopper Knight did was he went out and rounded up a sophisticated team. There was no social media at the time, so names were just shouted out in pubs and clubs, and the common name that kept occurring was Richardson gang enforcer Jimmy Moody. Now Jimmy was approached and he asked how much money was on offer. The figure was thrown out was millions of pounds, and of course Jimmy gladly accepted. The gang consisted of Charlie Chopper Knight, the General, Jimmy Moody the Muslim enforcer, John William Woodruff, who was also known as Big Bad John, Tony Knightley, who was respected bad guy and even commanded the respect of police, and Bernie Khan, who was half Indian. All cash-in-transit robberies were meticulously planned. Charlie Chopper Knight scouted the route, checked out the employees driving the vans, and also checked police exposure in certain areas. At an East End pub, vans were robbed and costumes such as ginger and blonde wigs, moustaches and beards and glasses, overalls and even dresses were put into holders, and a catch of GUNs such as sawn-offs and revolvers were checked and double-checked again. Now Charlie Chopper Knight managed to create a monopoly on the cash-in-transit robberies because they had strong armed security guards by either offering money or promising to K their family. They was told that when the gang would approach the transit vans, they would need to stop. Otherwise, the consequences would be dire. And of course, the employees that were driving the vans were part of Express Security. So, the Express Security drivers were said to be in fear after the gang would show up at the family home with a jerry can and a lighter and also a Remington. Now, Jimmy Moody was ready to fire on any have-a-go hero and also innocent bystander if they got in the way. Initially, the gang ambushed the cash-in-transit vans on a Thursday. This was payday, which was why the newspaper dubbed the emerging gang the Thursday Gang. Now, Charlie Chopper Knight, who was 38 years old at the time, wanted the gang to be famous, to carry out jobs up and down the country, as far as wide from London to Essex to Welshpool to Dundee to Oban. The infamous and dangerous Chainsaw Gang were armed with sawn-offs and revolvers and hammers and axes. The cash-in-transit vans would be pulled over at the side of the road, either by force or by pre-arrangement. Jimmy Moody was said to have a sawn-off in one hand and also a pistol in the other, and he would walk swaying his hips and his arms. An axe was then used to take out the windscreen, On one occasion, Jimmy had used the butt of the sawn-off to strike an express security guard in the face because they refused to exit the van. The man had suffered a fractured skull and suffered permanent injuries that put him on disability for the rest of his life. On a separate occasion, a transit van was pulled over in a black wall tunnel. The gang had used a chainsaw to cut out a rectangle shape at the side of the van before the money was taken and transferred to another vehicle that was waiting. Charlie was the person responsible for handling the cash. Now, the black wall tunnel job was said to have been better than any high on the market at the time, with the gang reportedly getting away with £100,000 cash. The money was then taken to a flop house within hours of the robbery being committed. Jimmy Moody actually commanded an extra 1% fee due to his fearsome reputation, and nobody argued with him. In late winter of 1977, Bernie Kahn drove a Ford Escort in a 6-vehicle convoy as it headed across the river and into South London suburbs en route to Banstead. When in Banstead, 2 of the other vehicles were shadowing the Security Express van from the moment it left the bank in the high street. Cars were systematically placed in front and behind of the security cash in transit van. Now, Jimmy Moody appeared from the side street and actually caused a collision with the cash in transit van, making the van stop. At that time, all gang members had exited their cars and approached the cash in transit. Sawn-offs and revolvers were then used. An axe was used to take out the front windscreen, and all employees were dragged from the van. All 4 tyres were blown out, while Charlie Chopper Knight stood outside, arms folded with a stopwatch, calculating the time it took. Jimmy Moody then fired a warning shot, stopping the traffic in the near distance, while the other gang members decided to cut open the side of the van. Large sums of money was taken from the cash in transit van. Now, because Jimmy Moody liked the theatrics, at the time he was actually wearing a police uniform, complete with white helmets. The entire incident just took 2 minutes and 30 seconds. The gang left with at least 9 bags, and in each bag there was £25,000. Of course, the money was then taken to the East End safe house and divvied up. Ultimately, the gang's downfall was because Samuel Benefield turned informer and ratted on the whole gang. In order to understand who Samuel Benefield was, he was a supergrass and a former member of the Thursday gang. Now, he wasn't a prime member, he was just used and utilised during some of the raids. When it was all said and done, the Chainsaw Gang is said to have made over £2 million in cash, making them at the time one of the most successful and efficient robbery gangs in the entire UK. Stay safe.